Opal felt the dust first. It was a coating on her tongue, a grit in her eyelashes, a fine red powder that had settled into the very weave of her worn dress. For 3 days she had walked, following the deep ruts of a wagon trail that promised civilization but delivered only an endless expanse of sky and sage. The settlement of Promise Creek had been a bitter joke, a handful of half-built shacks and hollow-eyed people who had nothing to spare. Not even a kind word. They had pointed her north towards the Rocking R Ranch. Biggest spread in the territory, a man had rasped, spitting tobacco juice near her feet. If anyone's hiring, it's Dutch Calloway. The name had been spoken with a mixture of fear and respect that Opal understood all too well. It was the sound of power. Now, standing at the edge of the ranch yard, she felt her own insignificance. The Rocking R was not a ranch. It was a kingdom. A sprawling main house built of thick, dark logs stood like a fortress, its porch wide enough to hold a dozen men. Barns and corrals and bunkhouses radiated out from it, neat and well-tended, smelling of horses, hay, and the sharp tang of the blacksmith's forge. Men moved with purpose, their silhouettes dark against the afternoon sun, the creak of their saddle leather a constant, rhythmic song. This was a world of muscle and sweat and masculine certainty, and she was a ghost haunting its edges. A woman with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a grief so heavy it felt like a second skeleton inside her own. Her husband, Thomas, had died a month ago, his body racked with a fever that had burned through their wagon train like a prairie fire. They had buried him in a shallow grave marked with a cross made of 2 sticks, and the wagon master, a man with eyes like chips of slate, had given her an hour to grieve before telling her she and her meager things were being left behind. She was dead weight. Opal had not cried. The tears were a frozen lump in her throat, a place too cold and hard for Sarsoso to melt. She had simply started walking. Taking a breath that tasted of dust and manure, she forced her feet to move. She walked towards the largest group of men, who were gathered near a corral, watching a rangy cowboy try and fail to stay on a bucking sorrel. Their laughter was loud and harsh. She kept her eyes fixed on the porch of the main house, her destination. She would not be deterred by noise. She had learned long ago that the loudest men were often the most hollow. A man detached himself from the group and blocked her path. He was broad and thick, with a sun-scorched face and a sneer that seemed permanently etched into his features. His stained hat was pushed back on his head, and he hooked his thumbs in his belt. "Lost, little lady? I'm looking for the man in charge," Opal said, her voice steadier than she felt. It was a small voice, but clear. The man's sneer widened. "You're looking at him. I'm Cole, the foreman. What's your business?" He looked her up and down, a slow, insolent appraisal that made her skin crawl. He saw the worn dress, the scuffed boots, the exhaustion clinging to her like a shroud. He dismissed her in a single glance. "I heard you might need a cook," she said, lifting her chin. The job notice was still up on the post in Promise Creek. Cole stared at her for a silent moment, and then he threw his head back and laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a bark of disbelief, sharp and cruel. The other men near the corral heard it and turned, their curiosity piqued. Cole gestured at her with a sweep of his arm. "Boys, hear that? This little bit of nothing thinks she can cook for the Rocking R." The laughter spread like a contagion. It rolled over Opal, a wave of mockery that sought to drown her. They laughed at her size, at her audacity, at the very idea of a lone, as destitute woman walking into their world and asking for a place in it. She stood her ground, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the cold lump in her throat hardening into something that felt like iron. She had survived her husband's death, the abandonment, the long walk through nowhere. She would survive this. "Is Mr. Calloway here?" she asked, her voice cutting through their mirth. She directed the question past Cole into the sudden quiet. The laughter died. A shadow fell over them from the porch. A man stood there, tall and still, his presence silencing the yard without a single word. He was built of long, hard lines, from the square set of his jaw to the worn leather of his boots. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind and something deeper, something that looked like loss. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on her. This was Dutch Calloway. This was power. He descended the steps slowly, his spurs making a soft, deliberate chime on the wood. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze missing nothing. He saw the dust and the desperation, but his eyes lingered on hers, and for a moment, Opal felt as if he were looking straight through her skin to the iron core beneath. "Cole," Dutch said, his voice a low rumble, "what is this?" "Just some stray, boss," Cole said, his bravado returning. "Looking for a handout. Says she wants the cook's job." He chuckled again. But it was a nervous sound now. Dutch's gaze did not leave Opal's face. "Is that so?" "Yes, mister," she said. "I can cook. I'm a hard worker. I don't require much." The last cook was a man who could wrestle a steer to the ground and chop a cord of wood before breakfast, Dutch stated, his voice flat. "This is a hard place for a woman alone." It wasn't a question. It was a dismissal, quieter than Cole's laughter, but just as final. "Hardship and I are well acquainted," Opal said, the words tasting of ash. "Being a woman doesn't make my hands less capable of peeling a potato or kneading dough. And being a man didn't make your last cook's biscuits any less like rocks. A flicker of something, surprise. Maybe even amusement, passed through Dutch's stormy eyes. The men shifted, their silence thick with anticipation. No one spoke to Dutch Calloway like that. Cole's face darkened with fury. Dutch was silent for a long time, studying her. He was a man who had built a wall around himself, brick by painful brick. He had lost his wife, Sarah, in childbirth 5 years ago, and the child with her. The silence in the big house was a testament to his grief. He did not invite complication into his life. He did not invite feeling. This woman, with her quiet lessons and eyes that held a sorrow to match his own, was a complication. His every instinct told him to send her away. But he had seen her stand unflinching in the face of his men's ridicule. He saw a strength there, a brittle, desperate courage that reminded him of a lone fence post holding against a blizzard. "The cook's quarters are behind the main house," he said, the words surprising everyone, including himself. "There's a pump for water and a woodpile. Supper is at sundown for 20 men. Breakfast is at dawn. If the men complain, you're gone. If you cause trouble, you're gone." He turned and walked back toward the house without another word, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Cole shot her a look of pure venom, a promise of future trouble. But Opal didn't see him. She was looking at the small cabin behind the big house, a curl of smoke whispering from its stone chimney. It was a roof. It was a chance. It was more than she'd had in a month. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, the iron in her core settling from a weapon into a foundation. She had a place, for now. The first week was a silent battle. The men, led by Cole's open hostility, treated her like a ghost. They ate her food without comment, leaving their plates scraped clean but offering no word of thanks. They left muddy boots by the door for her to clean, their unspoken message clear. "You are a servant." Cole went out of his way to make her life difficult, demanding last-minute changes to meals, complaining that the coffee was too weak or the bacon too crisp. Opal met it all with a quiet, unyielding competence. She rose before the sun, her hands raw from lye soap and hot water. She baked bread that was soft and light, brewed coffee that was black and strong, and stewed beef until it fell apart on the fork. She did not speak unless spoken to, and she met their stony glares with a placid calm that seemed to unnerve them more than anger would have. Dutch remained a distant, formidable presence. He ate his meals in the main house, his plate brought to him by one of the younger hands. But Opal felt his eyes on her. Sometimes, when she was hanging laundry or tending the small herb garden she'd started by the kitchen door, she would feel a prickling on her neck and look up to see him watching from the porch, his expression unreadable. He was judging her, weighing her, and she did not know if she was passing his test. Her first small victory came not in the kitchen, but in the corral. Dutch owned a beautiful bay mare named Willow, a horse with fire in her eyes and a spirit to match. She had lost her foal to a mountain cat a few months back and had been wild with grief and fear ever since. She would lash out at anyone who came near, her teeth bared, her hooves a blur of deadly force. The men had given up on her, leaving her to pace the far end of her paddock in miserable isolation. Opal watched her for days. She saw the same raw, untamed grief in the horse that she felt in her own heart. One afternoon, when the yard was quiet, she gathered a handful of wild chamomile and sweet clover she'd found growing by the creek. She approached the paddock slowly, not looking directly at the mare. She hummed a low, tuneless song, the same one her mother used to sing to calm her as a child. Willow stopped her frantic pacing, her ears swiveled, twitching toward the soft sound. She snorted, a plume of dust rising from the ground, but she did not charge. Opal leaned against the fence, her movements slow and deliberate, and held out the handful of herbs on her flat palm. She did not move closer. She simply waited, humming her quiet song, her presence an offering, not a demand. The mare watched her with wide, intelligent eyes. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. The scent of the sweet clover reached her, and her nostrils flared. For 10 long minutes they remained like that, a silent negotiation between two wounded souls. Finally, with a shuddering sigh, Willow stretched out her neck and delicately lipped the herbs from Opal's palm. Her muzzle was velvety soft against Opal's skin. Opal did not move, did not even breathe, until the mare had finished and lifted her head, looking at her with something other than fear. From the shadow of the barn, Dutch watched the entire exchange. He had seen his best men thrown and bitten by that mare. He had watched her spirit curdle into something dangerous and broken. He had all but given up on her, and now this slip of a woman, who looked as if a strong wind could blow her away, had calmed her with a handful of weeds and a quiet song. He saw not weakness in her gentleness, but a profound and unfamiliar kind of strength. It was the first crack in the wall around his heart. He turned and walked away before she could see him, a strange turmoil churning in his gut. The second crack came a week later. A young hand named Billy, barely 18, was mending a stretch of barbed wire when a length of it snapped back, laying open his forearm from wrist to elbow. He stumbled into the yard, his face pale with shock, blood soaking the sleeve of his shirt. The men gathered around, their voices a useless babble of advice. Cole, ever the pragmatist, shoved a bottle of whiskey at him. "Drink this. Then we'll burn it shut." Billy looked like he was about to faint. Just then, Opal came out of the kitchen, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. She took one look at the wound, and her calm efficiency took over. "Bring him to the kitchen now," she commanded. Her voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that cut through the panic. The men, surprised into obedience, helped the trembling boy to a chair at the kitchen table. "Get me clean water and rags. And someone fetch my canvas satchel from my room," she ordered. Cole sneered. "What are you going to do, woman? Sing it better?" Opal ignored him. She gently took Billy's arm, her touch surprisingly firm. "It's a clean cut, but deep. It will need stitching." She opened the satchel a boy brought her, revealing neat bundles of dried herbs, vials of tinctures, and a small oilskin-wrapped packet containing a curved needle and fine gut thread. The men watched, mesmerized, as she worked. She washed the wound with a decoction of yarrow to stop the bleeding, her movements swift and sure. She made a poultice of comfrey and plantain leaves, which she explained would ward off infection and help the flesh knit. "Where'd you learn all this?" one of the men asked, his voice hushed with awe. "My mother was a healer," Opal said, not looking up from her work. "She taught me what the earth provides." With Billy fortified by a sip of whiskey and a willow bark tincture for the pain, she began to stitch the wound. Her hands did not tremble. Each stitch was small, neat, and precise. It was a beautiful, terrible kind of needlework. Dutch stood in the doorway, watching in silence. He saw the same steady competence he'd seen with the mare, the same quiet authority. He remembered the frantic, useless panic of the doctor who had attended his wife, the man's hands shaking, his face slick with sweat. He remembered the feeling of utter helplessness as Sarah's life had slipped away. He watched Opal tie the final knot and bandage the arm neatly, her face a mask of concentration, and he felt a pang of something he couldn't name, a phantom limb of hope, aching where there had only been numb scar tissue. By the next morning, Billy's arm was clean, the swelling had gone down, and his fever was gone. The men's talk in the bunkhouse that night was different. The laughter was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. She wasn't just a cook. She was something more. She was useful. Cole's scowl deepened. Opal's quiet competence was a direct threat to his loud, blustering authority. And he began to watch her with a new, more dangerous kind of hatred. The seasons began to turn. The brutal heat of summer softened into the golden light of early autumn. The rhythms of the ranch became the rhythms of Opal's life. She knew the men by the sound of their footsteps, by the way they took their coffee, by the wounds and worries they slowly, hesitantly, began to bring to her. She was no longer a ghost in their world. She was a quiet, essential part of its machinery. Her interactions with Dutch evolved into a delicate, unspoken dance. He took to drinking his morning coffee on the kitchen steps, watching her work. They rarely spoke more than a few words, but the silence between them grew comfortable, freighted with a meaning that words would have spoiled. He noticed things about her, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the small hum that escaped her lips when she kneaded dough, the fierce intelligence in her eyes when she read the labels on his supply tins. He realized she was literate, a rarity that set her even further apart. One day, he found her struggling to split the tough logs for the kitchen stove, her small frame straining with the effort. He said nothing, but the next morning, a new, smaller axe with a perfectly honed blade was resting against the chopping block, and the woodpile was stacked high with logs already split to the perfect size. He never mentioned it. She sent a slice of her apple cake, still warm from the oven, to the main house for his supper. He never mentioned that either, but he left the plate clean. These small, unspoken gestures became their language. He saw her mending one of his torn shirts by candlelight, her fingers nimble and quick. The next day, a brand new sewing basket with a full complement of needles and threads appeared on the kitchen table. She noticed him rubbing his shoulder, stiff from an old injury. That evening, a small pot of arnica salve was left on the porch railing outside his office. It was a conversation held in deeds, not words. A slow, careful building of trust between two people who had forgotten what trust felt like. The ache of longing began to grow in Opal's chest. She was drawn to this broken, powerful man, to the deep well of sorrow in his eyes that she recognized so well. She saw the goodness in him, buried beneath layers of guilt and grief. But she knew her place. She was an employee, a stray he had taken in. To hope for more was a foolishness she could not afford. One night, a fierce autumn storm blew in, the wind howling like a banshee, rattling the windows of the main house. A shutter on an upstairs window broke loose, slamming against the side of the house with a percussive rhythm that echoed the thunder. Worried it would break the glass, Opal pulled on a heavy coat and went out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at her, whipping her hair across her face and stealing her breath. She fought her way to the side of the house and struggled to reach the swinging shutter, her fingers numb with cold. Suddenly, a large, warm presence was behind her. Dutch. He had come out after her. He reached up, his much longer arms easily catching the wild shutter. "I'll hold it," he shouted over the wind. "You hammer the nail back in." She fumbled for the hammer she'd brought, her hands shaking from cold and proximity. He was so close she could feel the heat of his body, smell the scent of rain, leather, and him. As she lifted the hammer, her hand slipped. His hand came down over hers, engulfing it, steadying it. His skin was warm and calloused against hers. The touch was like a lightning strike, a jolt of pure energy that shot through her entire body. The wind and the rain and the thunder faded into a dull roar. All she was aware of was the weight of his hand, the strength in his grip, the shocking intimacy of the moment. She could feel his breath on her cheek. He guided her hand, and with two sharp strikes, the nail was driven home. The shutter was secure. For a long moment, neither of them moved. His hand remained over hers, their fingers laced together. He was looking down at her, his face shadowed, his eyes dark and intense. The carefully constructed walls between them crumbled, leaving them exposed and vulnerable in the heart of the storm. He wanted to lean down, to close the small distance between them, to feel if her lips were as soft as he imagined. The need terrified him. It felt like a betrayal of the wife he had lost, a breaking of a vow he had made to his own grief. He pulled his hand back as if burned. Stepping away, the cold rushed into the space between them. He saw her shiver, her dress soaked through, wordlessly. He shrugged off his heavy wool coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was huge on her, warm and heavy, smelling of him. "Go inside," he said, his voice rough. "You'll catch your death." He turned and strode back into the main house, leaving her alone in the rain. Clutching his coat around her, her heart hammering a rhythm as wild as the storm. Cole had seen it all from the bunkhouse window. He had watched Dutch follow her out into the storm, had seen the moment their hands touched, had seen the way they stood frozen in the rain. He saw the coat settle on her shoulders. The foreman's resentment, which had been simmering for months, boiled over into a venomous, jealous rage. She was not just a threat to his authority anymore. She was a threat to his pride. He saw her as an interloper, stealing the respect of the men, and, now the attention of the boss. He decided it was time to remove her permanently. He was a patient man when it came to cruelty. He started subtly. He began asking questions of the newer hands, the ones who had passed through Promise Creek. He pieced together the story of the wagon train, of the fever, of the husband buried on the prairie, and in that tragedy he found his weapon. Sickness was the great, terrifying unknown of the frontier. It was a more potent fear than rustlers or drought. He started the rumor in the bunkhouse, a quiet word here, a dark suggestion there. "Funny how she showed up right after that cholera swept through her wagon train, ain't it?" he'd say. "They call it a walking plague. Sometimes people carry it for months, shedding it everywhere they go." He planted the seed of fear, and he knew the fertile ground of ignorance and superstition would make it grow. Soon, the men began to change. They no longer met her eyes. They stepped back when she approached. A man she offered a salve to for a rope burn refused it, muttering something about not wanting her taint on him. The small island of respect she had built for herself was eroding, washed away by a tide of fear. The whispers followed her everywhere. They called her the plague woman, the widow of misfortune. Her isolation became a wall, thicker and more cruel than any she had known before. She was a ghost once more. Dutch was scheduled to be away for a week, taking a herd of steers to the railhead 40 miles north. He left Cole in charge, a decision that sealed Opal's fate. The moment Dutch's horse was a speck on the horizon, Cole made his move. He strode into her kitchen, a smug, triumphant look on his face. The other men lingered in the doorway, their expressions a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. "Pack your things," Cole said, his voice dripping with false regret. "You're done here." Opal straightened from the stove, her heart turning to ice. "Dutch didn't say anything to me. He told me," Cole lied smoothly. "He can't risk it. The men are spooked. They think you carry sickness. He said for the good of the ranch, you have to go. He wants you gone before he gets back." Said he couldn't face telling himself. It was a cruel, brilliant lie. It played on her own insecurities, on her knowledge that she was an outsider. She looked past Cole to the faces in the doorway. She saw no support there, only averted eyes and shuffling feet. They believed him, or they were too scared not to. She knew in her gut it was a lie, that the Dutch who had covered her with his coat in the storm would not do this. But what could she do? She had no power, no voice. Cole was the foreman. His word was law in Dutch's absence. To fight would be useless, humiliating. Perhaps it was for the best, she thought. A bitter resignation settling over her. Cole was poisoning the ranch against her. If she stayed, she would only bring more trouble, more division. She would be a wedge driven into the heart of the place Dutch had built. Leaving was the only way to protect him from the mess Cole had made. "Fine," she said, her voice a dead, quiet thing. She untied her apron and folded it neatly on the table. She walked to her small room, the men parting to let her pass, as if she truly were contaminated. She packed her few belongings back into the small satchel she had arrived with. It did not take long. She left Dutch's heavy wool coat folded at the foot of her bed. It was the only thing of value she possessed. And she could not take it. She wrote a short note on a scrap of paper. "Thank you for your kindness. It was more than I deserved. Goodbye." She left it on the kitchen table and walked out of the cookhouse without a backward glance. She walked out of the ranch yard, past the corral where Willow watched her go, and set her face towards the empty horizon. She was walking into nowhere again. Dutch returned 2 days early, a good price for his cattle and a favorable wind having sped his journey. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The usual clatter and comforting smells from the cookhouse were absent. The air felt dead. He swung down from his horse and strode to the kitchen. It was cold and empty. On the table he saw her note. He read the 3 short sentences, and a cold dread washed over him. He turned and saw Cole swaggering out of the bunkhouse, a triumphant smirk on his face. In that moment, Dutch knew. He knew it as surely as he knew the brand on his own cattle. He strode across the yard and met Cole halfway. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Gone," Cole said, trying to maintain his bravado. "Like you said, for the good of the ranch." The men were scared of the sickness she brought with her. Dutch's rage, which he had kept leashed and buried for 5 long years, broke free. It was not hot and loud, but cold and terrifying. He grabbed Cole by the front of his shirt, lifting him half off his feet. The other men, drawn by the confrontation, froze where they stood. "There is no sickness here," Dutch growled, his face inches from Cole's, "except the one you spread with your rotten tongue. This ranch is built on hard work and loyalty. You have shown neither. You used fear to drive out a good woman, because you were too small a man to stand in her shadow. Get your things. Be off my land before sundown. If I ever sees your face again, I will personally see that it is no longer recognizable." He shoved Cole away from him. The foreman stumbled back, his face pale with shock and fear. He had miscalculated. He had thought Dutch's grief had made him weak, but he had only made it focused. Cole turned and scurried toward the bunkhouse. Without another word, his authority shattered. Dutch turned to the other men, his eyes blazing. Anyone who believes a lie over the evidence of their own eyes is welcome to ride out with him. No one moved. Their shame was a palpable thing in the afternoon sun. Without another glance at them, Dutch swung back onto his horse. He didn't need to ask which way she had gone. There was only one road. He spurred his horse into a gallop, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt since the night his wife died. The fear of being too late. He found her 5 miles down the road, a small, solitary figure walking with a slumped determination. He rode up alongside her and dismounted, his movements stiff with urgency. "Opal." She stopped and turned, her face smudged with dust, her eyes hollow. She looked at him not with relief, but with a deep, weary sadness. "You should not have come after me, Mr. Calloway. I'll only cause you more trouble." "Dutch," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "My name is Dutch, and the only trouble at the Rocking R is the trouble that comes from losing you." He took a step closer. Cole lied. "I never told him to send you away. I would never." A single tear finally escaped the frozen place inside her, tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "I know," she whispered, "but they were afraid." "They were fools," he said simply. "And I was a fool for leaving him in charge. The ranch isn't the same without you, Opal. I am not the same. Please, come home." He did not command her, he asked. He stood before her, the most powerful man in the territory, stripped of his pride, his loneliness, an open wound. He was asking for her help to heal it. She looked at his face, at the raw vulnerability in his stormy eyes, and saw not a powerful rancher but a man as broken and lonely as she was. In that moment, she knew she loved him. She gave a small, shaky nod. As they rode back toward the ranch, a strange, acrid smell reached them on the wind. Smoke. Dutch reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the northern horizon. A plume of dark smoke was rising against the blue sky. "Grass fire," he said, his voice grim. "The storm." A dry lightning strike must have smoldered for days before finding purchase, and the wind was blowing it straight toward the north pasture, where he kept his best breeding stock, including Willow. By the time they crested the last ridge, the fire was a horrifying spectacle, a roaring, rolling wall of orange flame, consuming the dry autumn grass with incredible speed. The ranch hands were already there, a frantic, disorganized line of men beating at the edges of the fire with wet blankets and shovels, their efforts pitiful against the inferno. Dutch swore and galloped down the slope, shouting orders, trying to organize a firebreak, to save what he could. Opal watched for a moment, her mind racing. She could see the herd of horses in the pasture, trapped between the fire and a deep ravine. They were panicked, running in circles, their whinnies shrill with terror. She knew that in their fear, they would soon stampede, and their instincts would drive them blindly, perhaps even into the flames or over the edge of the rim. While Dutch fought the fire, Opal knew she had to save the herd. It was the heart of his ranch, the future he was trying to build. She spurred her horse, not towards the men, but in a wide, circling path around the fire, towards the panicked animals. Dutch saw her go and shouted her name, thinking she had lost her mind, that she was riding to her death. Opal paid him no mind. She knew things about horses that the men, for all their skill, did not. She knew that a herd would follow its lead mare, and that the lead mare could be turned. She rode hard, the heat of the fire scorching her face, until she was ahead of the terrified herd. She found Willow, her eyes rolling, her body trembling, about to lead the stampede. Instead of shouting, Opal began to sing, the same low, calming hum she had used at the corral. It was a thread of sanity in the roaring chaos. Willow's ears twitched. The mare saw her, this small, familiar human, a point of calm in a world of fire and fear. Opal didn't charge at her. She simply rode a steady, arcing path away from the fire, towards a narrow opening that led to the safety of a creek bed. She kept singing, her voice rising just enough to cut through the roar. Willow hesitated. The herd milled behind her, their panic momentarily held in check. Then, with a great shuddering snort, the mare turned and followed Opal. The entire herd, 30 of the finest horses in the territory, followed their leader, a river of horseflesh pouring through the gap and down to the safety of the water, just as the fire swept over the ridge where they had been trapped. From across the blackened field, Dutch and his men watched in stunned silence. The fifer break they were digging would have been too little, too late. She had not just saved his horses. She had saved his entire legacy. She had done it not with brute force, but with courage, wisdom, and a quiet understanding that no man there possessed. She had saved him. The fire burned itself out against the creek bed. The danger was over. The men looked at Opal, who sat on her horse among the now calm herd, her face black with soot, her expression serene. They looked at her not as a cook, not as a woman, but as the person who had saved the rocking R. Their respect was absolute, and their shame for ever doubting her was just as profound. It was deep fall. The cottonwoods along the creek had turned a brilliant, buttery yellow, and the air had a crisp, clean edge to it. Coal was a distant memory, and the ranch had settled into a new rhythm, a better one. Opal was no longer just the cook. She was the heart of the ranch. She managed the supplies, tended the men's injuries, and her own opinion was sought on everything from the health of a new foal to the placement of a new fence line. The men called her Mrs. Opal, their voices filled with a genuine, earned respect. She was not running the ranch through orders, but through a quiet competence that everyone had come to depend on. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Dutch found her on the porch of the main house. She was watching the colors fade, a small, peaceful smile on her face. He had spent the last weeks rebuilding, not just the burned fences, but the broken trust within himself. She had shown him that gentleness was a form of strength, and that opening his heart was not a betrayal of his past, but the only way to have a future. He sat down in the chair beside her, their shoulders brushing. For a long time they sat in a comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear. Finally, he broke the quiet. He held out a thick, leather-bound book, the ranch ledger. "The books are a mess," he said, his voice low. "I've never had a head for figures." She looked from the ledger to his face. His eyes were clear. The storm in them finally calmed. "What are you saying, Dutch?" "I'm saying I can't run this place alone anymore," he said. It was not a proposal of marriage, not yet. It was something more fundamental, an admission, a partnership, a statement of irreversible need. He was handing her the reins to his kingdom, not because she was a woman he desired, but because she was a partner he could not live without. She took the ledger from him, its weight solid and real in her hands. She ran her fingers over the tooled leather cover. She had arrived with nothing but dust and grief. Now she held a future. She looked at Dutch, at this good, strong man who had seen the iron in her when everyone else saw only weakness, and her heart was so full it felt like it might burst. "I suppose I can have a look at them," she said softly. He smiled, a true, real smile that reached his eyes and erased the last of the shadows. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. They fit together as if they were made for it. On the horizon, the last light of day bled away, leaving the vast, starry sky of the frontier. The world was still wild and dangerous, but here on this porch, with his hand holding hers, Opal was finally, truly home.